Hello and welcome to another of our video lectures on diachronic sociolinguistics. Today we are going to discuss reconstructed proto-languages and what can we say about the sociolinguistic reality behind those proto-languages, or can we say something about it? So proto-language, a reconstructed one, still has to work like a real language, so we must accept same kind of realism from proto-languages as we know from natural languages known to us. But the problem is that then there are some things that we really can't reconstruct, like variation. So this basically impossible to reconstruct dialects to proto-language based on the historical comparative method. We always have a fragmentary knowledge about some parts of the proto-language, so much is left for interpretation, and the different areas of the language can be reconstructed to different degree. For example, phonology often can be reconstructed to in much more detail than, for example, syntax. This variation, it's a major issue that all languages have some kind of variation, a real variation, social variation, but we can't really reconstruct that into proto-language. As you already know, if you watch the first video in our REMODUS Diachronic Sociolinguistics series, you know that there are these two different positions in proto-language. So we have the formalist position and realist position. So it's two different ways to approach proto-language. So the formalized position means that the reconstructed languages are abstract ideal notations, whereas the realist position means that assumes that the reconstructed forms are real and proto-language is a real natural language. And as already mentioned, the issue of variation is one of the central concepts here, because uniformity is necessary if we want to reconstruct a proto-language, and we can always sort of reconstruct away the variation that we have, and this is a real problem for us here. And of course, when we look at some like a diverging proto-language, we can then assume that these diverge different dialects, but when we are dealing with such entities, we are already dealing with stages that postdate the proto-language that has been reconstructed. And then there are always some problems that really, well, some problematic situation where we don't really know what we should reconstruct. For example, in the morphology of the Uralic languages, we have this dental stop and nasal n, so t and n in the second person verbal endings, and it's not quite clear how this sort of duality has emerged. Then we have, for example, the word for three in Proto-Uralic, in Proto-Finno-Ugric in the classical sense, where we have this strange RM cluster in Hungarian and Mansi, whereas the other languages point to LM, and then there have been different ideas on how to what to reconstruct here. So there is really no answer to this problem with variation, but then about these gaps that I mentioned. So often lexicon and phonology can be reconstructed in more detail than morphology and syntax, and Proto-Uralic, reconstruction of Proto-Uralic is a very good example of this. That we have hundreds of words, but then the morphophonology and syntax, there are many things that we don't understand completely. To continue with issues, the proto-language, there have been attempts to distinguish between different chronological stages of proto-languages. So there's this time-space hypothesis. So in the Europeanist, Wolfgang Maid has written a lot about this. You'll see the references in the bibliography slide, but this actually poses a problem for the comparative method. So how can we really reconstruct these different stages if we have this one result of comparative method, which is the proto-language before it diverges? We can't really reconstruct different stages here. Well, then the internal reconstruction of a language, and in this case of proto-language, can potentially reveal different chronological stages. So that's a different issue, but it's not not the, but well, yes. So there are there are issues with this time-space hypothesis. But obviously, not all variation, well, this was like chronological variation and then areal variation, so dialects, that's a very typical thing that languages have, but one also often has different registers, so social variation, and theoretically one can attempt to distinguish different registers in the vocabulary of a reconstructed proto-language. So for example, it's sometimes assumed that some words belong to child's language, so they are nursery terms, so it would be one register, and then there have been attempts to reconstruct, for example, the Proto-Indo-European poetic language, which also would be one specific register. So people would, that's not the way people usually speak, but the way poets speak, or people speak when they recite poems. So that's some kind of, obviously this is something that some kind of social variation perhaps can be reconstructed, but this is also something that's not very easy. And then this is related to these language external issues, this whole thing of proto-language, that if we can reconstruct a number of words, theoretically that should give us evidence of the culture of the speakers of the proto-language. And there is this linguistic paleontology, well-known method that attempts to reconstruct prehistory culture based on the linguistic material that we have. But that's again something that's not quite easy because first of all, because diachronic semantics, we don't always know what was the exact meaning of the given word in proto-language. And there are really no laws in semantics, and it's very difficult to reconstruct the semantic developments, and also it's not always clear whether some word goes really back to the proto-language itself or whether it's later innovation. So it's, well, often it's easy to say that something goes back to proto-language. In some cases it can be contested. And as mentioned, the reconstructed lexicon always gives an incomplete picture of the actual languages. And cultural elements can diffuse later, and this can sort of create some kind of mirage of what we really know about the sort of proto-culture. Here's a good example from Juhani Lehtiranta's Common Sami Vocabulary, where it seems to be possible to reconstruct the word for bullet to Proto-Sami, but this is a Scandinavian loan, first of all, and Proto-Sami certainly must have diverged before the introduction of firearms into Northern Europe. So despite the regular sound correspondences, this cannot be a Proto-Sami word. And well, there is also this serious issue, so argumentum ex silentio, that if there is no word for something, that does not mean that the speakers would not have known that concept, because words do get lost. And if we, for example, if we are dealing with proto-language like Proto-Uralic, spoken thousands of years ago, words have, clearly we know only a fragment of its vocabulary, and it's very difficult to say that because there was no word for this and this, they could not know this and this thing. Of course, then this is something that's quite, this kind of argument is actually used quite often, but it's debated how well it actually works. Now, very brief overview of Proto-Uralic lexicon as we know it. So cultural lexicon, there is an overview by Kaisa Häkkinen from 2001, which is not completely up to date, but still quite useful. So there is one controversial word from metal, which is heavily disputed whether it goes back to Proto-Uralic. We have no terms related to agriculture, and we have some disputed mythological lexicon, and well, some words related to boats, for example. So we can attempt to reconstruct the culture based on these. Then we have more words related to mobility, some basic tools and weapons, and obviously then quite general terminology for nature. Perhaps some further cultural words like word for some kind of merchandise, which, well, might not actually go back to Proto-Uralic, and which seems to be some kind of loan word denoting stealing, also word to sue, and some other basic cultural words. But then if you look at some cases that might be more interesting, like the words for some kind of shaman. That's something which we can't necessarily reconstruct the Proto-Uralic because of unclarities in the vowel relations. So here we have close meanings between cognates, but the phonological irregularities make it difficult to decide whether we really can reconstruct this into Proto-Uralic. Then we have this interesting issue that we have a bunch of kinship and social terms that we can reconstruct the Proto-Uralic, but here also we have significant gaps here. So we don't really have like the word for sister, for example. We do have the word for mother, possibly the word for father, but word for different kind of uncles and in-laws. But then there are a bunch of words that we can't really reconstruct. So that's also shows a very, very interesting picture, and this is a good example of how fragmentary our picture of the social relations of Proto-Uralic speakers is, and what kind of challenges are involved. So thank you for your attention. Here are references, and I hope you will watch the other videos in our Diachronic Sociolinguistics series as well. Thank you.